Today we're going to be answering some of the listener questions which have been flowing in all week. Before we get to listener questions though, Freddie, the big story at the end of this week has been Diane Abbott and Labour selections. What's the latest? I understand you've been investigating this for the New Statesman.
Yeah, I've been trying to speak to Labour MPs today, and it's completely changed this afternoon. We've had a U-turn from the leadership. It was briefed out on Tuesday. The NEC, that's the National Executive Committee that Keir Starmer has a majority on, was going to block Diane Abbott's candidacy in Hackney, where she's been an MP for nearly 40 years. That was the state of play. There's been a huge backlash. So we've had MPs briefing, mostly anonymously, but briefing how upset they are. We've also had some community black leaders come out and say that they disagreed with it. We also had the trade unions, a good list of trade unions come out and say that she should be reinstated as the candidate. So the pressure was building. It was a big question for Keir Starmer whether he held his nerve or whether he capitulated, and he did the latter, which I think is remarkable because all we've seen for the past 4 years or so since he became leader is this increasing ratchet of control that Keir Starmer and his team has had over the party. We saw that with the conference back in 21, I think it was, when they changed the rules around, or maybe it was 22, when they changed the rules around leadership elections, and we've seen that with the expulsion of Jeremy Corbyn. And this was the latest. This was part of the swooping in of the Keir Starmer's team to try and get rid of some of those left-wing candidates.
Oh yeah, with Faiza Shaheen.
So yeah, Diane Abbott, it's shocking, I think, that they've had to do so. I think some people will be surprised. Keir Starmer has taken a blow to his authority, but let's see where it goes from there. I think they'll hope that this calms it down and that it moves on. I think it was becoming too big of a story for them. It had gone on for too long, too many days, and they hope this will draw a line under it.
Yeah, so what's your read on this? Because Angela Rayner came out on Thursday, really out of the blue, saying she didn't see any reason why Diane Abbott shouldn't be the Labour candidate. And there has also been, as you say, Freddie, and as you've written for the New Statesman, a lot of outrage and upset over other candidate selections, people that people might not have heard of because they're not MPs yet, but who were parachuted into what look like they're going to be very safe seats or barred from standing. A lot of sort of bad blood about the selection process in general. Do you see allowing Diane Abbott to stand again for a seat that she's held for 37 years as a way of kind of smoothing that over, a kind of throwing one positive thing to the left while enabling the rest of the selection round to go Starmer's way? Or is it all just a bit of a mess?
It's a bit of a mess, but I think you're right. This is an exception to the rule. The rule is that Keir Starmer is trying to clear out as many of those MPs he think will cause him lots of trouble in the future Parliament. That's been the case, as I said, for many years. I think the pressure just became too much. We've got to remember that Diane Abbott is seen in a completely different light as Jeremy Corbyn is. She's much more revered. She's a symbolic figure because she was the first black woman MP, and that does matter, and that means you get people across the aisle saying that she should be kept in the party. It's interesting, like Andrew Gibson, the Tory journalist who writes for Conservative Home, he wrote a column today saying it was outrageous that she couldn't stand, and he just said she's a great parliamentarian. He completely disagrees with much of what she says, but she should be able to stand for election, particularly given she's been selected by her CLP. So I think that's the difference here. It's interesting that no one, or Corbyn's expulsion didn't have the same effect. I was at Corbyn's campaign launch on, was it Wednesday night? I think it was. It was fascinating. It was, Corbyn 4 years ago, 5 years ago, he was fighting for 650 constituencies across the country. He was trying to become prime minister. Now he's just an independent candidate trying to maintain his place in Parliament. It was quite a surreal atmosphere, but it's completely different to Diane Abbott standing outside Hackney Town Hall, where she also intimated that she was standing as an independent. That was a suggestion, and I think that was essentially a threat, because if the Labour HQ, Labour hierarchy were faced with two big names standing as independents in London, I think that would have caused more ripples, more distraction, more of this media attention than they would have liked. So I think that's part of the reason they also capitulated.
Yeah, and of course, if Diane Abbott is standing to be a Labour candidate, she can't campaign for Jeremy Corbyn, who's running against the Labour candidate as an independent. So there's that aspect of it too. Okay, we've had loads of questions flooding in. Please keep them coming. But let's kick off this You Ask Us session with a question sent in by somebody who calls themselves Rishi Sunak, asking, have I made a big mistake? Freddie, has Rishi Sunak made a big mistake?
Good to know he's finding time to listen to the podcast on the campaign. Has he made a big mistake? I'm not sure, because their calculation seems to have been it would have got worse over the summer. And we also saw that their campaign at the start of this period was awful. And we've discussed that many days. They had sort of 4 or 5 days of Rishi Sunak in the rain, gaffes, disunity, defections. The attention has shifted this week to Labour because of the Diane Abbott story and because of the left-wing purge that we've seen in Labour. But the most interesting thing, I think, is that within or amid this noise, all of this coverage, all this commentary that we do, all the pieces that we write, all the news, the polls haven't shifted yet. And I think they'll be disappointed by that, because you're seeing a deficit that I don't think we've ever seen a governing party go into an election, a short campaign, play out and maintain itself. So I think the Conservative campaign will be asking themselves, well, maybe it would be better to have wait for something to come up. Will he regret it? I'm not sure, because he probably doesn't want to be PM for very much longer. What do you think, Rachel?
He does give the impression sometimes of a man who has given up and has had it. I don't think going early, and let's say early, going earlier than the latest possible deadline he could have gone for, I don't think that's a mistake in and of itself. What I do think is a mistake is how much it has antagonized the party, because it came out of nowhere, particularly local associations who devoted all of their energy to the May local and mayoral elections, and they got their volunteers out and they got their campaign finances in order, and they were just told that they could have a bit of a break, and now they're back into full campaign mode. And okay, not everyone is Steve Baker, who is gone off to campaigning in Greece, catamaran sailing. Good for him, good for Steve. But I think you're still getting, a week later, you're still getting briefings from Conservatives being like, I just don't understand why the U-turn had to be that sudden. Now, the argument for the U-turn being that sudden, for it being so unexpected, is because Downing Street, the Conservative Party, is very, very leaky. And clearly a decision was made that if this was a wider discussion, it would obviously be leaked, and they didn't want that to happen. They wanted it to seem really decisive. But just the amount of energy that an election campaign takes, I still think that beginning a campaign with the people who are meant to be on your side being really quite frustrated with you and disengaged is going to disadvantage you even more than it would have been. But I also, I've seen the polls, they were dropping month on month pretty regularly, and there was absolutely no guarantee that something better would have come up, particularly with a long summer of channel crossings and some uncertainty over whether any Rwanda flights would take off. So I can see the rationale for going now, but people are very upset about it. Unless, of course, the question from Rishi Sunak is, did I make a big mistake by being Prime Minister in the first place? But I think that's a whole other podcast.
Okay, we've got a question from Will here, who asks, Ed Davey's general election campaign is being criticised for being frivolous, heaven forbid. Jo Swinson was criticised for being too serious and claiming she offered a genuine alternative. How do journalists think Lib Dems should campaign?
Well, just to recap, this week we've had Ed Davey paddleboarding in Lake Windermere and falling into the water multiple times, some of which were deliberate. And then we had him riding a bicycle down a hill like a children's TV presenter with his legs sort of splayed out, looking like he was having a great time. Then we had him on a water slide. And today, on Friday, he's just doing some lovely baking with some children, isn't he?
He's like a really nice time. He's sort of like
having the time of his life.
Yeah, why are they doing it though? I mean, to get media attention.
And it's working.
Aside from the fact that they have so few policies, I think that's probably why. You stick Ed Davey on a slide, everyone will talk about that, and they won't talk about austerity or Lib Dem's record in government or their mortgage policies or their lack thereof. So that's probably why. I think people talk about it. It's quite jolly. They're trying to paint Ed Davey in a human light. And also it draws a contrast with the sort of the shenanigans going on in the Tory party and the Labour Party. And here comes Ed Davey through the middle on his bike with his legs stuck out.
Yeah, on his water sliding into politics. I also think, sort of context-wise, the place that the Lib Dems are trying to fill in this election, or in elections in general, has shifted. In 2019, Jo Swinson said she was going for over 100 seats, and she was interviewed. She said she wanted to be Prime Minister. She ran the campaign as though she could conceivably be Prime Minister. Going for over 100 seats, the Lib Dems won 11, and Jo Swinson herself lost her seat, and they were the fourth largest party, so they slipped out of the running to be the third largest party to the SNP again, who got 48 seats. And then in 2010, going back to the Nick Clegg sort of super era, they got 57 seats there, which is significant, but still to kind of go from that in 2010 to Jo Swinson 9 years later going, I could be Prime Minister, that looks a little bit silly. The campaign this time is much, much more targeted. The Lib Dems have a shortlist of around 40 target seats they're going for, and they are a by-election winning machine. They're very, very good locally on the ground. Seats like Chesham and Amersham, Somerton and Frome, where Ed Davey was on his water slide. And the thing about local campaigns is that you can dedicate the campaign to local issues, which for the Lib Dems often include opposition to house building, whereas their national manifesto has building loads of affordable houses. And so similar to how we were talking about the Greens, Hannah and I were talking about the Greens yesterday, there were a lot of inconsistencies and contradictions in the Lib Dem campaign. What I think their strategy is to go really granular on the ground or on a local level, and then have Ed Davey having fun, grabbing headlines, just to sort of remind everyone that the Lib Dems are there. But so there's less of a focus on the national policy. And for all that it's being criticised, I think it's working.
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking to some Lib Dem strategists this week. I think the plan is to send Ed Davey as far away from their target seats at the start of the campaign, send him to Wales, wherever, the north of England, wherever else it might be, and then bring him back to those blue wall, southern, rural seats that they hope to target during the end of the campaign when it really matters. I think that's the overall plan. That's why we're seeing some more of this frivolous, tokenistic, gimmicky campaigning at the start. But just going back to 2019, it was a completely different political world. We've got to remember that the Lib Dems came second in the European elections just before the summer. The Brexit Party came first. So there was a sense that politics was completely realigning. Boris Johnson's election as a Conservative Party leader sort of put a stop to that, because he was able to claw back some of the votes from Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party. But there was a sense, I mean, we didn't know what was going to happen. It was certain. We were getting certain results during that summer, which indicated that there was a gap opening up for a Remain party. You've got to remember the Lib Dems had their bollocks to Brexit slogan. So that was their whole strategy. Now, of course, that we've sort of returned to that two major party system where most people will probably vote for the Labour or the Conservatives. And that just leaves less space for Lib Dems.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And it's sort of worth remembering that even though Boris Johnson did win that landslide majority in 2019, in the run-up to the election, that didn't seem like a particularly likely, certainly not a certain outcome. It was all very up in the air. There was lots of noise in that election. And it's easy to look back in hindsight and go, well, obviously he was going to win. But I remember that campaign. It didn't feel that way at the time. Okay, talking of parties that are dramatically reduced from their ambitions, this question comes from Black Rose Angel 123 from YouTube, who asks, with the Tories' terrible start to the campaign, how bad do you think it could get for them? Do you think there is genuinely a possibility of them not even being in opposition, the main opposition party? What would need to happen for them to slip into third? Also, what do you think the long-term consequences of that could be? Could they recover? Freddie, what do you reckon?
I think the most important thing here is that the polls have not yet narrowed. We've still got 5 weeks left, so that might change, particularly if the Labour Party have the week that they've just had again and again. But I don't think the fundamentals are going to change. So It depends, because what we've seen in recent years, we had a great chart on this morning in Morning Call, is that the increase in number of seats that are marginals. It means that the electorate is much more volatile. It means that the result is much harder to predict. And it means that tiny changes in that overall popular vote can result in much larger changes in seats. And that's what will decide whether the Conservative Party is this irrelevant rump, with 60 seats, 100 seats, or whatever it be, or they get a more respectable sort of 150 to 200, and they'll sort of be where the Labour Party was back in 2019. And I think that's the key thing. And it will be interesting to see how the rest of the sort of right-wing ecosystem reacts to that result, how Nigel Farage, how the Brexiteers react, how the think tanks, how the journalists, the Telegraph, all of them react.
News.
GB News, yeah, completely. And that does matter, because there will be a genuine outcry and concern if there's this Labour hegemonic power that looks as if it's going to be in government for 10 years. And they'll think, do we need to realign? Do we need to create a new party? Or they'll go, okay, if we have 200 seats, then sure, we'll have to reassess how we sell our politics and what our policies are. But the Conservative Party itself will be sustainable, I think. What do you think, Rachel?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about wipeout defeats with the Tories, we kind of use that term for a really wide range of possibilities.
Yeah.
1997 is seen as a catastrophic wipeout, and they got 163 MPs, which is, on one level devastating, but on another level, as we were saying a moment ago, in 2010, the Lib Dems had their brilliant result of 57 MPs. So that's still 3 times as many. You're still very obviously in a two-party system with one party being the government and one party being the main opposition. And even that poll, the catastrophic poll that the Telegraph ran in January, the one that sort of triggered a whole load of renewed questions over whether Rishi Sunak should be the leader, that had them falling to 98 seats, I think, which would be historically unthinkable, but would still have them as the main opposition party. So I think there are challenges for the Conservatives going forward. I've spoken to a lot of younger Conservatives, or Conservatives who are worried about the generational aspect. What does it mean that only 8% of people aged 18 to 24 currently would consider voting Conservative? What does it mean that among the under 50s, the Conservatives are polling worse than the Greens? How do you mitigate that generational effect going forward? But I think in this election, we're looking at 100 to 200 seats. And in terms of the campaign going terribly, obviously it hasn't gone very well. But one line that I've heard is resonating, and it's not a line that the Conservatives can be particularly public about, but is saying on the doorstep, look, we're not campaigning to win. We know Labour is going to win, but do you want to hand Keir Starmer a supermajority? Do you really want him to have that power? Or can you vote for us just to make the Labour landslide a little bit reduced, just to make life a little bit harder for him? And apparently that line is resonating far more than vote us into government again. So in a way, that's an admission of failure, but it's also a sign that there is a sort of core group of Conservative support that isn't just going to wither away to zero.
Yeah, it's interesting that the left are also doing that. The Greens are doing that. Some of the more disillusioned former Labour members are also saying vote for independents like Jeremy Corbyn or the Greens to send Keir Starmer a message to make sure that he doesn't have this supermajority. And also on volatile voters, we've got to remember that it can go both ways. They might also just leave Labour in the next 5 years and go back to the Tories. People are just apathetic. I think they see, in complete contrast to the America, by the way, where people are so polarized they would never even dream of voting for the other party. Whereas here in the UK, I think people, they see them all as the same, and they don't like them. Therefore, they're happy to change to get rid of them. Okay, Rachel, I think this one is you'll be good at this one. We've got one from someone called Rich Treacle. Why do we still talk about older people like they're the Second World War generation? They're mostly dead. Why didn't we remember that those in their 70s and 80s are more like the Beatles generation?
This is a great question, and it drives me absolutely mad. So the vast majority of the veterans from World War II have sadly died by this point. They're either over 100 or very, very close to getting there. If you were 18 in 1945, then you would be 97, 98 at the moment. And yeah, the way we talk about the over 60s is as if they're the generation that came 30 or 40 years before them. I think it's just partly to do with nostalgia. When people grow up hearing the stories of their parents and grandparents, that's the kind of cultural message that they absorb, and the Conservatives have certainly found it really effective to hone in on that nostalgia and challenge it. I think it's really interesting that the national service proposal, which it's never going to happen, it's completely unworkable, but it does poll very well with the over 60s, who themselves could never have done national service, the vast majority of them. So it's a tactic that works. In terms of why don't we remember, I think like culturally, the Second World War looms kind of so large in the British psyche that we kind of forget how far away we are from it now. I think it's fading though, and I think it's interesting that if all the polls are right and Labour do win this election, this is going to be the first election where the baby boomer generation as a whole, obviously there's huge amounts of variation within a generation, but where the election doesn't go the way that the majority of that generation vote. And I think that's going to be really significant, that generation as a cohort has been on the winning side of elections up until now. So I think this might be the last election where we have this sort of cultural amnesia or truncating of history. But it's a really good question. We'll have to wait and see. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you, Freddie, this is the first full week of campaigning over. Do you have a favourite moment? What's been your highlight?
Okay, I would say it's probably at Jeremy Corbyn's launch. I found that extremely surreal. It was a very old crowd. There was a sense that people had been campaigning on these issues for 40, 50 years, and this was just the latest cause that they wanted to support. I was sitting next to one woman. She left the Labour Party over the Falklands War, but she'd known Jeremy Corbyn since his days on Haringey Council. But Corbyn started his speech, and he led a round of happy birthday, and the cake came out from the wings, and there were candles on it, whatever, for one of his election agent. It was a very surreal moment, because on Twitter you had these memes flying around of the purge of the left, the night of the long nights, whatever it might be, and then Jeremy Corbyn looking quite happy, I must say, stood at the podium, back where he's been off the national stage and onto the more local stage, singing happy birthday. So that was a surreal moment. Favorite, I'm not sure, but surreal, definitely.
Well, mine is it was also surreal, but in a different way. It's sort of received wisdom in campaigns, or for politicians in general, particularly during election campaigns, that you need to have a minder checking what the backdrop behind them is. And we've already had a couple of moments where Rishi Sunak really needed that. There was one where last week it looked like cranes were coming out of his head, like antennae. There was one where he was photographed on a plane by the exit sign. But my favorite one is the day after he had come after quote unquote Mickey Mouse degrees, and saying that 1 in 8 university courses should be scrapped to fund apprenticeships instead. He was photographed in an event he was doing in Milton Keynes behind a piece of factory equipment that just gave him giant Mickey Mouse ears. And it could not have been better if it had been posed. And whoever that photographer was, I just think that's going to be one of the images of the campaign. It doesn't really tell us anything about Rishi Sunak. It doesn't really tell us anything about the policies in general, but I guess it's a reminder that person who tags along behind candidates and kind of checks the backdrop religiously and goes, "Do not stand there," that person's job is very important.